am honored to introduce Sherri Goodman. Sherri is hosting, curating this session with our military security leaders. Sherri is really the mother of climate and security, is literally what we were discussing backstage, coined the term climate change as a threat multiplier for our security threats. She was the first undersecretary for environmental security at the Pentagon during the Clinton administration when I first met her. She is on the board of the Atlantic Council. She's the chair of the Council on Strategic Risk and a senior strategist at the Center for Climate and Security. And with that, Sherri, thank you so much to you and to Paul and to Dirk, who both told me not Admiral, not Lieutenant General. We're doing Paul and Dirk today. They are retired, but incredible leaders. Thank you all for joining us.
Oh, come on, you could make it a little louder, you know? All right, okay. All right, at least a few people got up. I can tell this isn't truly a military audience because the seats aren't filled. You're not all in the middle sitting at attention, okay? But a few of you got up with us, so very happy to be here with all of you this morning. We're really looking forward to this discussion to talk about military leadership on climate change and climate security and bring this discussion into the framework of this conference. So, you know, a little bit about you. Any of you who, like me, grew up in the Cold War, you know, the greatest threats then were the threat of, you know, a bolt out of the blue nuclear attack by the Soviet Union. And that was considered a low probability but very high consequence threat. So we spent billions of America's GDP to defend against that. We actually have here in General Jameson, Dirk this morning, the former commander of all U.S. land-based nuclear forces, ICBM forces. Now, we won the Cold War. We still have nukes, but you know, now we've moved from the Cold War to the climate era. Inarguably, what we have is a high probability, high consequence risk in climate change. And that's how we frame this risk. We characterized it as a threat multiplier. About 12 years ago now, in 2007, after I had served in the Department of Defense, I formed a military advisory board at a think tank called the Center for Naval Analysis with generals and admirals from across all our military departments, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and we did a deep dive for about a year on understanding climate change, climate science. We learned from leading climate scientists at a time when military leaders in the Department of Defense were not really thinking about climate change as a national security issue. And after a year of study and research and analysis and meeting with many leaders and traveling to the UK, meeting with leaders there and their scientists and military leaders, we issued a report called National Security and the Threat of Climate Change, where we characterize climate change as a threat multiplier for instability in fragile regions of the world, and now we see it happening here at home as well. And since that time, this has begun at least a decade and a half now of work within the U.S. Department of Defense, our military services, our intelligence community, our foreign policy community, on understanding the global security implications of climate change. And I just want to read what I think is an important quote to you from a recent, couple of years ago, Pentagon report that says, among the future trends that will impact our national security is climate change. Rising global temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, climbing sea levels, and more extreme weather events will intensify the challenges of global instability, hunger, poverty, and conflict. They will likely lead to food and water shortages, pandemic disease, disputes over refugees and resources, and destruction by natural disasters in regions across the globe. That's your United States Department of Defense speaking in those words there. So the military, our military has plans to address this, probably not sufficiently funded at this point, but there are strategies and plans, and that's what we're going to get into and talk a little bit about this morning. I'm very privileged to have here with me Paul, or Admiral Z as he was known, the 25th Commandant of the Coast Guard, most recent Commandant, and in which he served till 2018. He has served from the Arctic to the Gulf and around the globe. In his 41 years of active duty in 8 commands, included 3 Coast Guard cutters, and emerged as the gold standard for promoting maritime safety and security. And most importantly, he now lives in Hawaii. So he made the hardship trip to come here, but he did get in a big bike ride yesterday, he told me. So we've got a real active athlete here. And also with us today is Dirk, or Lieutenant General Arlen Jameson. As I mentioned, he used to command all of our land-based nuclear ICBM forces. His last assignment was as Deputy Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Strategic Command. He comes to us here from Austin, Texas, and he's had an extensive career across all of our air forces and deployed around the world. And it's really a pleasure to have both of them here. Now, I'd like to start with you, Paul, and can you share with us from your experience in the Coast Guard how climate change affected your service?
When I would sit with the members of the Joint Chiefs, if you were to condense what the Coast Guard's missions are, we protect the nation from threats on the sea, but then we protect the sea itself. And there's not another service out there that has that as their mission statement. And so we talk about what does it mean to protect the sea. Obviously it means oil pollution, it means plastic, it means the northern migration of fisheries as we see in a warming ocean. What are the implications of ocean acidification? And even more importantly, what are the implications of a rising sea level? So in my 4 years as the Commandant of the Coast Guard, I literally toured the world. Pacific Island nations at extreme high tides in the Marshall Islands and Kiribati, Kwajalein, where Dirk well knows, we have strategic assets there that may very soon be underwater. And so we need to start planning for what are the implications of a rising sea level. I would read about this. There was a book that came out in 2007 by Mark Linus. It's called 6 Degrees. The 6 degrees are a 6 degree Celsius rise in temperature. The recent studies that just came out, we now have a 415 part per million CO2 concentration in our atmosphere. It's going to take a century to metabolize that CO2, but if you look from mid-60s to present day, it looks like a vertical launch in terms of greenhouse gas concentrations. In my estimation, we will blow through the 2 degrees Celsius aspiration under the Paris Accords. But when you get to 6 degrees Celsius, in Mark Linus's book, we are now a world in chaos with mass migration, with people fleeing their countries, stressing infrastructure elsewhere, and it's a world that we quite honestly have not planned for. Military planners, and no one plans better than the military, which is why I'm honored to be on the advisory board with the Senate for Climate and Security. We're paying attention to this, but this is really going to take whole of government. The military, we can be apolitical about this, and it's unfortunate that we have politicized an issue. It would be no different than I go to the doctor, I've got high blood pressure. They said, if you don't change your diet and your lifestyle, you will have a stroke and die. Well, you can see the very same data that's out there when it comes to climate change, but we're not changing our behavior.
Right. Well, Dirk, in your time in service preceded a little bit some of the current severe extreme weather impacts we see. But tell us a little bit how you came to be involved on these matters since you left service, and then also let's talk a little bit about our current bases affected by increased extreme weather events and sea level rise.
Well, it's absolutely true, and you can see that I am a little bit earlier in the process than the Admiral, and I certainly want to say that I admire what the Coast Guard does, and I would count myself as a strong supporter of the things that go on the seas. I will agree that when I was wrapping up my career, nobody was talking in the military and in, let's say, in the planning sessions about the problems with rising global temperatures or the effects of that. And certainly the military was responding in those days to emergencies that were caused by the climate, because we were certainly having them. If you recall Hurricane Andrew in 1972, which was a Category 5 hurricane. But so that was not a part of what I was worried about as I walked out the door, and I thought we had won the Cold War, as you said, so go relax and enjoy. But I became acquainted with a small group of what we call in the military fast burners. These are people that are really thinking out there. As Paul said, the military has to do that to stay ahead. And this was a small group. It was an Air Force group, but I assume that there were other groups working. And they were directly under the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. And they were really thinking about what is going to happen if you put a rising population, and they were going out to the 2100 time frame, and you put that with the predictable rise in temperatures, because the scientists were then telling us what was going to happen if everybody wasn't paying attention. And you look at the possibilities that the areas of a conflict would, how they might be affected by climate, by a rising climate or catastrophic weather events. And they were really projecting some of the things that we see in the climate with the accelerant to armed conflict and that sort of thing. So I got interested in that. This was about 20 years ago. This was, early into I think the process within the DoD, but you may know better, Sherri, you probably do. But I started listening to these guys, and they were saying, and also if you look at the per capita use of energy in the United States, and you project that over to Japan or China or Africa, and people will want to move up, like we have the benefit of that. And so they were saying that's also going to exacerbate this emerging issue. So again, a small group of us started with some encouragement from some really good people, going around the country and saying there is a connection between climate change and national security, and began to kind of lay out the case for that. And we went to great places like Indianapolis and Tucson, Arizona, and every place had some issues that people could begin to see the possibilities and be alarmed. And certainly, as time has passed now, it's become clear that we can't ignore. I mean, the temperature in Paris this morning, or today in Paris, is 107 degrees. I haven't checked Austin, Texas. I know that Typhoon Haiyan in 1983 killed 6,500 people and had winds of 200 miles an hour. But in 2018, we had Michael hit the Gulf, take out Tyndall Air Force Base, essentially. Billions of dollars worth of damage go on up and hit Camp Lejeune. And in the same month, almost the same 3-week period, Typhoon Tuhu hit Saipan, Guam, Marianas Islands, same force winds, not quite the damage, kind of a glancing blow on our strategic base in Guam. And so we can't ignore this, and you're not. I know we're talking to people that really are aware. So I would only say that what people frequently say, what can we do about it? And I think, as described, the military is paying close attention. They know what they're up against in terms of responding, protecting their assets, and being able to do their mission, and in a world that's much more complicated. I would say that you can talk to your elected officials, and you should talk to them in very straightforward terms. And I'm not going to tell you what to say, but being in this crowd, I have a hunch. I got a suspicion what you're going to say. And the last thing I would say is, over the course of the 20 years that I just mentioned, military people have become very involved. Every base, I would assume every ship, has an awareness of the kinds of things we're talking about, the catastrophic weather events, the investments on the bases to deal with climate change and those kinds of things. They're aware. So veterans have been trained, and they go to places where armed conflict is happening. I would only say that don't forget that as you look to people that, as they transition, are really up to speed. And I'll leave it at that, Sherri.
Well, thank you, Dirk. And as you observed, just in the last year, 3 major military bases in the United States suffered devastating damage from hurricanes or floods. Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida, Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, and Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, with a estimated cost of repairing just those 3 bases at over $8 billion. Yesterday, 2 of our colleagues, retired Admiral Ann Phillips and retired Admiral David Titley, former naval oceanographer, testified before the House Budget Committee on the costs of resetting our military bases and our military communities to prepare for resilience. Ann Phillips happens to work in Virginia now, and Norfolk, Virginia, works for the governor there on climate resilience and ensuring that our largest complex of military facilities in the world, which is in the Norfolk Hampton Roads area with over 40 military bases and critical shipyards and fleets and a NATO command headquarters there as well. And every day they are suffering regular sunny day flooding that often prevents people from getting from their home to their base because they have water in the streets regularly. And as you said, it's an all of community, all of government action to address this. Not one that just the military can do. It's important the military has to play its role, but since the infrastructures are integrated between the electrical, utility, sewer, water, transportation systems, these are solutions that have to be done together. Paul, let's talk a little bit about the Arctic. Last year, about a year ago, you and I were together in Alaska at the Arctic Maritime Symposium organized by the U.S. Alaska Command and Northern Command, and we were looking at Arctic strategy and plans to, as our last Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, said, up our game in the Arctic. Or as the current Secretary of Navy, when asked by Congress, why do we need to increase our presence of forces in the Arctic? He said, well, the damn thing melted. Okay. Now, you've been directly involved in helping prepare the Coast Guard to better operate in the Arctic. It has long been the service on the front lines of duty in that region. Talk to us about that and the changes you've seen during your time in service.
Sure, Sherri. Thank you. And first and foremost, we're dealing with the consequences. We try to stay out of the heated debates. Is this man-made? Is this cyclical? And as a military leader, we don't want to find ourselves the salami between those 2 slices of bread. So I got to deal with the consequences. So we've had an ocean open up that didn't exist. And quite honestly, it's an ocean where only 5% of it has been surveyed, charted to what we would say 21st century standards. And so as this ocean has opened up, We, policymakers and others, have written strategy after strategy, directives. We could probably build an icebreaker out of paper mache out of all the paper that we've addressed of a changing Arctic. Russia has taken advantage of this, have seen this opportunity. A new sea route, the Northern Sea Route, has opened up, and you now have natural gas coming out of the Yamal Peninsula, servicing the European continent, and it shaves nearly 3 weeks of transit time off ships going through there. But there's a catch. If you're going to go through the Northern Sea Route, we identify that as an international strait. Russia sees that as internal waters. Their Suez Canal, you have to have a Russian ice pilot, a Russian icebreaker to escort you through that. If we want to send one of my ships or a Navy warship up there, they now have a Northern Sea Route administration, and they say we have to provide them 45 days advance notice, provide all the ship's characteristics, and then they could either approve or deny our request to go through the Northern Sea Route. So if we think what's playing out in the East and South China Sea is absolutely volatile, well, we're seeing this play out, but we're just writing papers about it. Russia will soon put 3 corvettes up into the Arctic. They carry the Caliber M. It's a conventional missile. It's designed to take out infrastructure. Has a range of 2,800 miles. Our ability to intercept that, we have one shot, one opportunity to shoot this down before it can impact our infrastructure here in the United States. So we have this ocean opening up, but what we lack is a whole of government approach of what we're going to do about that. The good news is we're finally recapitalizing our ice-breaking fleet. We have 2 in our entire nation's inventory. Our GDP,
And how many do the Russians have?
40. And what's our GDP compared to that of Russia? More than 10 times the GDP of Russia. We have 2, they have 40. The numbers just don't add up. When you have these discussions, you've got to simplify it. And that's what I did in testifying before Congress, the 2 and 40. You know, it's Sputnik revisited. We now have inner space, the Arctic opening up, and we are sitting on our hands watching Russia basically exert sovereignty, you know, hegemony in this region, and the United States is being excluded. We need to work with Canada. We need to work with Norway, some of our NATO allies, and work collectively. We can't do this alone.
And talk about China in the Arctic today, if you will, how climate change in some ways is emboldening our adversaries to enter into new regions that could be future sources of geopolitical competition.
No, certainly, Sherri. Well, the Silk Road goes through the Arctic. It begins with, look at Greenland. 12% of its GDP is coming from China. And as the ice fields are melting, it's exposing rare earth metals. It looks like China has aspirations to control lithium, just almost like the OPEC of rare earth metals. 6% of the GDP in Iceland also comes from China. China's building a second icebreaker. The United States is the only G20 nation that has not ratified the Law of the Sea Convention. We have surveyed an area beyond our continental economic exclusive zone that goes out to 200 miles. You can go out to 350 miles. If you do survey work, do soil sediment sampling, and it matches the continental United States, it's yours. So we have an area about twice the size of the state of California that contains roughly 30% of the natural gas reserves, about 13% of oil reserves. It's not profitable to extract it today, but at some point in time, if we're continually dependent on fossil fuel, we're going to need to access that. Well, China has repeatedly done oceanographic research in this extended continental shelf of ours. And so if and when we ever ratify the Law of the Sea Convention and lay claim to this, we can certainly expect China to say, au contraire, these are global commons and we have always operated there. I guess the real test would be, does China move a mobile offshore drilling unit out there and start tapping into this just as they did off the coast of Vietnam? And then what do we do about that? So in the interim, I was able to establish an Arctic Coast Guard Forum with all 8 Arctic Council nations. China is not. They're an observer on the Arctic Council. But can we work collectively and try to de-escalate the militarization of the Arctic and look at what are the impacts on fisheries, safety of life at sea, the cultures, indigenous ways of life up there, because it does affect a lot of us equally, but try to turn the heat down is what we're starting to see as military escalation in the Arctic. Can we reverse that trend? I'm hopeful we can.
Okay, well, that's some serious stuff for this time of the morning. But you know, water is the front line of climate change, whether there's too much in certain places or not enough in others. And we know that persistent droughts across, for example, in Syria and much of the Middle East, were a factor in what has now become the most deadly civil war and civil strife in recent history. And so prolonged drought exacerbated by climate change, we now know from research done at the Center for Climate and Security and by other scholars, has been a factor in aggravating instability across drought-stricken regions of the Middle East and Africa. Dirk, in your experience with planning for some of these conflicts, how's water insecurity factored into our planning for managing
Well, for
humanitarian affairs and natural disasters?
for one thing, you have to have the water, and to transport the water to be where it's necessary to be for the troops, it causes a vulnerability that leads to casualties, and it's been an experience that's been very very tragic in our history of conflict in the Mideast. So that's one thing. I think that the projections in terms of water and having it are, you know, again, they're alarming. We see it every day. We have a lot of water in the central United States right now that we're trying to handle, but I would consider that a different matter, and so I think I leave it at there.
Yeah, let me, if I could just.
Please.
So, right now.
And then we're going to questions.
Okay.
Get your questions ready.
Sub-Saharan Africa, over 750 million people do not have access to clean water today. So where are they going to go? They're going to go north. They're going to go north into ungoverned states. They're going to lose hope. And you start looking at disenfranchised populations, then where do they turn to? Many of them turn to violent extremism. And if you really look back and play the tape back on Syria, 5 years of drought, agricultural failure, and then a government that could not attend to the needs of its constituents. You've got the very same dynamic playing out. 750 million people on the move. At a point in time where Europe is very migrant worried, we are migrant intolerant. So this is going to be another stressor, but water is going to be the catalyst. And there's not a whole lot we can do about that. We cannot ship bottles of water for 750 million people to sustain that population. They will move. The only question is how soon, and then what are the long-term consequences?
Right, we are living in the era of the greatest global migration since World War II, with waves of refugees. Some of them now, we are in the sort of first generation of climate refugees in many ways. We see that not only in our own country, where villages from Alaska to Louisiana are having to relocate to higher ground because of coastal erosion and sea level rise, but in the Pacific, this is a growing challenge with island states, Pacific Island states, potentially losing their sovereignty even within our lifetime because of rising sea levels or loss of freshwater sources, with Chinese ambitions in the region as well. Okay, I see a hand right there. Okay, Holly. Holly, and introduce yourself, if you will, please.
Oh, thank you. Holly Kaufman, and I had the great pleasure and honor of working for Sherri on climate change at DoD during the Clinton administration. So I have a question for all of you. Because DoD has been aware of this climate issue for 25, 30 years, we had briefings from the CIA about what climate change was going to do. The military's been so on top of this, and so I thought, great, the Defense Department, if nobody else can influence Congress. But of course, we at the time couldn't influence Congress. We were operating under the Byrd-Hagel Amendment, and we couldn't pre-implement Kyoto. Could you address how the Defense Department could possibly influence Congress, particularly with bases in key states being so affected? What can we do, or explain why DoD hasn't been able to get Congress to move, or what you might be able to do about it?
Well, I'm probably the most familiar with, the recent, the budget builds and, how do you get an appropriation? And it's encouraging to see, that DoD may see a $733 billion appropriation in non-discretionary funding. In discretionary funding. But we need to recapitalize our nuclear trident. We need to recapitalize, the losses from, we've been at war for 18 years now. So you've got all of these stressors on the budget, and not to mention the fact that, we have forces that are now supplementing our southwest border. Whenever there's a natural disaster anywhere in the world, oftentimes it's the U.S. military that's called upon to respond to that. And then you hope at the end of the day you get supplemental funding to offset that cost, but if you don't, then it eats a hole into readiness. And quite honestly, readiness is a very difficult sell on the Hill these days. Ready for what? And so the ready for what is China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and violent extremism. Our appropriation might address 1.5 of those campaigns, but it won't address all 5 at the same time. So if you now pile on climate change and say we now have 6, when I go to church, the sermon usually has 3 themes. And if you get to 4, then people lose attention. So I think the challenge is, that the span is so wide and the appropriation is not deep enough. And quite honestly, I think the upward trend in our discretionary appropriations are non-sustainable. When we're looking at interest on national debt in 2025 will be about $800 billion. It will exceed that of the DoD appropriation. And it's going to go up over time. It's not going to flatline at $800 billion. So that is going to be the dilemma, the holy grail that we're chasing right now. How many disasters, how many campfires is it going to take? How many Harveys, Irmas, Marias, those type of disasters before finally people agree that we can't maintain the status quo, which is why I used that blood pressure, we got to change our behavior. DoD can certainly lead that effort and the planning effort, but we need to bring interior along. We need to bring agriculture along. We need to bring state along. But certainly when you look at the planning machine, as you're well aware of, Holly, DoD can do this pretty well. But we need to do this in a whole of government approach.
Holly, I think you partly were talking about how do we overcome the political divide in the United States on climate change, and is military awareness and recognition sort of the solution to that challenge. In 2007, when we released that first CNA Military Advisory Board report, that very same week, the Senate Armed Services Committee, in a bipartisan effort, included the first several recommendations of the report into the Defense Authorization Bill, supported by Senator John Warner, who at the time was the ranking Republican on that committee. And over the last, and in fact, military leaders were, some of the military leaders like these gentlemen here, General Sullivan and Admiral Lopez, were among the first witnesses when McCain and Lieberman were sponsoring a bipartisan climate effort about a decade ago. And at every bipartisan effort on climate change, military leaders have been, leading the charge, so to speak. And as I mentioned, 2 of our colleagues testified yesterday. I testified a month or so ago, and others. So I think the solution set is there. and I think it's, now we're beginning to see, I think, a change in the congressional landscape on both sides of the aisle. There is now bipartisan support for climate solutions. But I see one more hand, and we have one more minute.
Sherri, could I? Oh, okay. Go
Let's take the last question, and then we'll just do a lightning round of response here. Yes.
Hi, I really enjoyed this. My name is Linda Vencel, and I'm the director for Global Health Security Agenda work with PATH. It's an international NGO. And I am working in a lot of countries. I just came from Burkina Faso and Mali. I'm going to India on Saturday. And I'm wondering whether, with the Department of Defense, we report to the National Security Council with this. And the whole plan with that is prevent, detect, and respond to outbreaks, but also to natural disasters and to climate change. And I was thinking that it would be very interesting because all the countries have to have a national action plan that's now being funded by multiple sources, including foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and national governments. If you could try to include more of your work with this work on global health security, because I've done already reviews in over 78 countries, and it's about getting countries more ready and prepared and working with the military. So I was wondering if that would be a real opportunity.
Thank you for underscoring that in our final moments here. I agree that the global health connections of climate change and national security is an area that deserves much more attention. It's beginning to get more attention as we understand that in changing disease vectors and spread of infectious disease is not only going to affect the readiness of our troops when they deploy, but also undermine stability in regions of the world such that you just described and where you've been working. With that, I know we're at the end. I'll give a final moment to our to General and Admiral here to make a closing comment.
Well, first of all, delighted, Amy, I want to thank you for pulling this together yet again. And I'm sure a lot of you are saying, okay, well, now what? It reminds me when I would drive through, some rural towns and a revival tent would go up and everyone would turn out and they would get religion and then the tent comes down and then everyone goes back to their daily lives. So what do we do with this at the end of the day? I think you've heard from, at the national level, the concerns, how do we elevate the narrative? And the narrative has got to be consistent across the board. We can't be speaking out of turn and say, well, if this isn't going to happen for another 100 years, then why do we need to deal with it today? But in my experience, as we talk about, how do we engage, congressional leaders, in my experience is, I brought an Inuit elder to testify about the Arctic. His family's lived up there for over a millennium. It's no different with how is our agricultural sector impacted? And those are the people that we need to get in front of our committees and speak firsthand of what is happening. Whether it's invasive species, the unpredictability of water, and now you're looking at subsidies because you've had crop failure. Look what's happening in Iowa. They missed a planting season. Those are the individuals whose voices really need to be heard. There's some great grassroots levels activities. I've been watching this in Hawaii. It's the first state to go on record to say we will be free of all greenhouse gases by 2045. So I just put up my solar panels and I got a nice subsidy from the state of Hawaii to do so. I don't know if they'll get there or not by 2045. But we also need to elevate some of these grassroots levels that are taking place and then get the advocacy from the administration to move this forward. So it really is groups like this that have spoken here, that are in this audience. Those are the voices that ultimately need to be here. Sherri, you've been working this. I've been working this. Dirk, you've been working this as well. But as they say in politics, all things are local. So I think bringing those local concerns up to a national level dialogue is in our best interest going forward.
Well, on that note, let me thank our panelists and let me thank Ami and the whole Sun Valley team here for bringing this together today. Thank you all.